Welcome to this 4th of July weekend episode of the Maza's Musings podcast. We are recording today, July 5th, the day after the festivities happened with the Maza household. We went to the local parade, and then afterwards we had our annual 4th of July barbecue. It was a great time, really a nice opportunity to just celebrate the country and try to keep things as positive as possible. So as we get into this week's episode, some people might be thinking that I'm taking an opportunity here to take down Hamilton, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary on Broadway and 5 years now on Disney Plus. I can tell you that that is not further from the truth. I absolutely adore Hamilton. I think that it is a terrific, terrific show. I have not had the opportunity to see it on Broadway. I've obviously watched it plenty on Disney Plus, and I've seen it locally in Hartford at the Bushnell Theater. And I really, really enjoy this show. So that is not the intention here. The intention here is really what I think Lin-Manuel Miranda wanted people to get out of this, and that's to have Hamilton, the play, act as a catalyst for gaining a better understanding of the history of this founding father and of the founding of our country in general. So that's really more of what this episode's about, and I'll get a little bit more into what brought this idea for this episode to the forefront. But before we do that, with this weekend being all about fun, let's have a laugh.
And now it's time for Meghan's
Cuckoo bananas.
Hi, Meghan.
Hi.
Do you have a joke for us?
Yes. How do you keep a skunk from smelling?
I don't know. How do you keep a skunk from smelling?
Hold its nose. Cuckoo.
All right. Want to say goodbye?
Bye.
All right. And while I mentioned that Hamilton has been on Disney Plus for 5 years, I do have one additional Disney-related item that I'm going to use for this week's Maza's Mickey Minute.
Donald, wake up! It's showtime! Don't forget the orchestra!
Ah, there you are. And just in time.
Mom says there's even more magical stuff now.
For those of you standing, please hold on to the handrails throughout our journey and stay clear of the doors.
Hang on to them hats and glasses, cause this here's the wildest ride in the wilderness.
And here we go!
Well, of course, with this being the 4th of July weekend, it seems appropriate that we would bring up the Hall of Presidents. Well, the Hall of Presidents at Walt Disney World has reopened. It reopened about a week ago, actually, on June 29th, after its refurbishment. And now, once again, President Trump is front and center. Now, if you're unfamiliar, in the Hall of Presidents, the current president always takes center stage and delivers the oath of office. It's said, and from what I've seen in pictures, it's a much more realistic looking audio animatronic of Donald Trump this time than the previous iteration. Now, outside of former President Biden and President Trump switching spots on the stage, it's been reported that there are no additional changes to the show. So if you're looking for the old faithful, that's what you're going to get still. It's just the new president is front and center where he's supposed to be. And if you want to feel presidential while on your next vacation, you should talk with We Do Travel Right. We Do Travel Right will offer you that concierge level service with the one-on-one attention of an agent, and that agent actually has the power of a team behind them, including the dining team. So they'll be able to get you all those hard to get reservations. They'll help you set up your hotel reservations. They'll help you with the park tickets, even things like navigating the parks and understanding how to use the apps and all that kind of stuff. And the best part about all of it is it's free. Yeah, you don't pay anything extra for using We Do Travel Right. That's because Disney or Universal or all inclusives or cruise lines, they all build the cost of using an agent into their pricing already. So you're paying for the agent whether you're using one or not. So doesn't it just make sense to use the agent? So if you are ready to get your next magical vacation started today, go to wedotravelright.com/Maza. That's wedotravelright.com/MAZA. Fill out the form and get your next vacation started today.
Now I can't do any more damage around this popsicle stand.
So long, partner.
See you real soon.
And now we will get into our main topic of this week, which of course is Hamilton.
History has its eyes on you.
So this episode is all about separating the fact from the fiction in what you're seeing in the show Hamilton. And obviously this is not going to be a complete dissection of it. These are just some of the main points that I've come up with after watching it several times. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background as to what the thought process was in developing this episode. A couple years back, Eileen, Meghan, and I went to Philadelphia. Meghan was all charged up to see the Liberty Bell, and I was really kind of afraid that she was not going to be as impressed with it as she thought she was going to be. It had been talked up. And she absolutely loved it. She was super excited. The park ranger who was there was awesome. And while we were there, around that Independence Hall area and everything, we decided to take a walk around and explore a little bit. And we ended up finding ourselves at the First U.S. Bank. And while we were there, a tour group kind of came by and was also in front of it. We weren't part of the tour group, but we were overhearing the tour guide. And of course, it was Alexander Hamilton's plan to establish a national bank, and his bill was enacted in 1791. Well, this tour guide was talking about the bank and made reference to Hamilton. And he actually talked about a talk that Lin-Manuel Miranda gave at a university in Philadelphia. And according to the tour guide, Miranda, who's from New York, didn't apologize for omitting Philadelphia from the show, even though that's where the first bank was founded. But Miranda did explain to the crowd that it would have been really lengthy to try and go through everything in the history of the nation's capital, because it moved several times. Like it was in Philadelphia, and then in Maryland a year later. Then it was back in Philadelphia. It was actually in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for like a day, and then in New York, and then returned to Philadelphia, and then it was in Princeton, New Jersey, and then it was in Annapolis, and then Trenton, New Jersey, and then back to New York City. And then in 1790 was when it was established through the Residence Act that Washington, D.C. would become the capital. But then it went back to Philadelphia temporarily while they were developing the capital in Washington, D.C. So all of that had me thinking, about, he had to condense all of that and, massage the history so that it would work in the narrative of a 2.5 to 3 hour show. So I was really thinking about what are some of the other things that Lin-Manuel Miranda had to massage, had to condense in order to fit everything in this story, in this really complicated part of our history. How do you fit all of that? And what are some of the ways that he manipulated the pieces to make that work? So this isn't so much an opportunity to point fingers and say, hey, you got this wrong, and you got this wrong, and you got this wrong. It's more Lin-Manuel Miranda had to take something and package it in such a way that would be effective for what he was doing. And in order to do that, he had to condense it. So really what my hope here is to expand it a little bit and to help people gain a little bit of an appreciation for what the actual history is and understand where these changes are, how they fit in with the actual history, and how it all fits together. So that's my little spiel on how how this all came about and why I'm doing this. So without any further ado, we should get right into the episode. And of course, the first thing that we need to talk about is the man himself.
Alexander Hamilton. My name is Alexander Hamilton. And there's a million things I haven't done. But just you wait, just you wait.
All right, so right off the top, one of the things that I want to talk about is the way that Hamilton is portrayed in this. And one of the really off the top, he's described as a bastard orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman. Now, this is, while very direct, also pretty much true. Hamilton was born in 1757 in the West Indies, and his father, James Hamilton, was a Scottish trader. And his mother was married to another man when Hamilton was born. So that forced his mother to have to leave her husband's home. And by the mid 1760s, James Hamilton had abandoned the family, and his mother had died of yellow fever. Now, something else in this is that Hamilton is referred to as an immigrant. And in the modern traditional sense of immigration, it's not exactly true. And let me explain. Obviously, as I said, he was born in the West Indies, and that's where he lived until basically his early teen years when he was sent to New York. And, he had help from an employer and some other people in getting him to a boarding school. At least I think it was a boarding school. It was a school in New Jersey. And then eventually he went to college in New York, which he never finished. But that's a little bit beside the point. Essentially, he moved from one British colony to another. So it's not really, he wasn't leaving his country and immigrating into another country. He was basically just it's basically like relocating states. I think that because of where he came from and from what I've read, he was considered an outsider by a lot of people, but an immigrant, not really. Hamilton was also portrayed in this as someone who was very anti-slavery, and it's not quite as cut and dry as all of that. It's a murky subject for him. It's a murky subject for a lot of our founding fathers. It's a less murky and very distinct issue for other founding fathers. But according to several historians, and by the way, all of this that I am presenting to you is stuff that I've read from various historians. So I cannot necessarily take credit for the work, and I'm going to try to give credit where it's due, wherever I can here. And in this case, it was Michael Newton, David Waldstreicher, and Jeffrey Paisley, who all said that to a certain extent, Hamilton was the founder of an anti-slavery group in New York called the New York Manumission Society. And they make reference to that in the play. He says a manumission abolitionist. Well, he wasn't necessarily a staunch abolitionist. Abolition at the time was a much more radical concept, and it wasn't something that, according to these historians, he subscribed to. He did support emancipation of slaves, but total abolition was not something that he's on record of being a big proponent for. He also supported Federalist slave owners for president. He was the Secretary of Treasury for George Washington, who was, of course, a slave owner. His father-in-law was a slave owner. And some historians actually believe that Hamilton may have owned slaves himself. Now, I'm guessing that probably they bolstered this part of Hamilton's history and his character to make him a more sympathetic protagonist, especially with modern audiences. And I think that's also something that by crafting him to be an immigrant, it kind of gives more of that working class kind of feel about him, so to speak. Now, moving on to another one of the major themes in this play, it's the Reynolds pamphlet. And now, those who have seen the play or are somewhat familiar with the history understand what the Reynolds pamphlet was. And in the play, the motivation for the Reynolds pamphlet was a meeting where Jefferson, Madison, and Burr approached Hamilton and accused him of illegal speculation. But in reality, those three had nothing to do with it at all. And Hamilton never admitted to them that James Reynolds was extorting him as a result of his affair with Maria Reynolds. Or actually probably pronounced Maria. I think there was some creative license taken with the name to make it sound better for whatever reason. Either way, it was actually House Speaker Frederick Muhlenberg, Representative Abraham Venable of Virginia, and future President James Monroe who accused Hamilton of illegal speculation. And that interaction wasn't actually what prompted Hamilton to write the Reynolds pamphlet like it was in the show. That was actually years later when a journalist named James Callender printed the accusations of the romantic misdeeds and illegal speculation. The show is correct in portraying Hamilton's motivations for writing the Reynolds pamphlet as stamping down the speculation accusations. Of course, it's also true that did humiliate Eliza and led to the end of any hopes for Hamilton becoming president. James Callender, by the way, was later tried for sedition by the Adams administration. And later, Callender also turned on Thomas Jefferson, who was a former ally of his, and exposed that he had fathered children with his slave Sally Hemings. Now, that had been something that had been rumored for some time, but Callender put it in print. Oh, and Maria and James Reynolds, they split up. That's a shocker, right? And Aaron Burr represented Maria as her attorney when they got divorced. Another big storyline in Hamilton is, of course, the election of 1800. The show is, of course, correct in the result with Jefferson winning and Burr becoming his vice president. But while Hamilton did work to convince Federalists to back Jefferson, it wasn't as simple as Hamilton casting a deciding vote. Voting was very complicated then, and what happened actually caused a change in the way America voted. Jefferson and Burr both received 73 electoral votes. And when that happened, it moved to a contingent election in the House of Representatives. And in the contingent election, the outgoing House of Representatives was controlled by the Federalists. And Hamilton did play a role in getting several Federalists to vote for Jefferson. But it wasn't a landslide, as the show says. He needed at least 9 to become president. On the 36th ballot, he got 10 votes. Also, Aaron Burr did not challenge Hamilton to a duel as a result of the election of 1800. That was actually a reaction to, well, it was a reaction to a lot, but it was after the New York election of 1804 when Burr was trying to run for governor as an independent. And Hamilton made efforts to thwart that by again rallying Federalists to vote against him. Well, Burr lost that election to Republican Morgan Lewis. And in February of 1804, a letter that detailed Hamilton's opinion of Burr that was expressed at a dinner party was published in the Albany Register. And that is what caused Burr to challenge Hamilton. Another couple of things that I wanted to bring up before I move on to our next character is while the two had strong disagreements, Adams didn't fire Hamilton, as it says in the show. Hamilton had already resigned in 1795 before Adams was elected. And also, we're led to believe that George Washington sent Hamilton home during the Revolutionary War at the behest of Eliza. Yeah, that's not really true. But the two did disagree, as the show says, over Hamilton's desire for a field command. And after that disagreement, Hamilton did leave the army for several months before Washington granted him a field command. And Hamilton ended up leading an assault during the siege of Yorktown, as it's described in the play. All right, we've got a little bit more that's going to intersect with this next character, so I'm going to get into that next character next.
Well, if it isn't Aaron Burr, sir.
Let's start out with this. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton were never friends. They were contemporaries, but things like the initial meeting and the group introduction with Lafayette and John Laurens and Hercules Mulligan were works of fiction, and that's by Miranda's own admission. Historian Michael Newton has pointed out that Lafayette wasn't even in America when Hamilton arrived. The show weaves Burr and Hamilton together far more often than they actually intersected, especially early on in their lives, probably in the interest of advancing the story and building more tension as we build toward that final duel. Here are a few examples of that. There's the duel between John Lawrence and Charles Lee, which did happen, but Burr wasn't there. Hamilton was Lawrence's second, but Lee's second was a man by the name of Major Evan Edwards. Also, Miranda wrote in his own book that he created the scene where Hamilton tries to enlist Burr to assist with the Federalist Papers. That never actually happened, at least to the knowledge of historians. And Burr and Hamilton did both serve on Washington's staff, but Burr wasn't there for very long before he was assigned to General Israel Putnam and became his aide. Now, the two did work together in defending Levee Weeks, as is mentioned in the musical. And Levee Weeks was accused of murdering Elma Sands in 1799, and the two had worked together on some cases previously. And this wasn't the first murder trial, as Hamilton says in the play, but it was the first with a recorded transcript, and it is considered the first sensational trial. One other note here. Aaron Burr didn't have to change parties to unseat Philip Schuyler, who was Hamilton's father-in-law, in the Senate, the way that is portrayed in the play. And that's largely because parties didn't exist the same way that they do now. And it was written by a historian whose name I did not write down here, and I apologize. But it was written that Burr kept a, quote, cautious distance towards all parties. Now, according to research presented by Monticello, Burr didn't take a public leadership role in the Republican Party until 1795. Now, Burr had defeated Schuyler in 1791. And parties aside, Hamilton was furious that his father-in-law had been beaten by Burr, and that fueled the rivalry that ended in the duel. So let's get to that duel. First off, the big thing that Miranda tries to impress here is that Hamilton was throwing away his shot by firing his weapon in the air. And personal accounts from the time and letters suggest that that was his plan. However, the truth is, nobody really knows. Hamilton's shot did hit a tree branch over Burr's head, but nobody saw what happened because both men's seconds were actually facing away from the duel so that they could claim deniability and say that they saw no fire. Some say both men fired, and Hamilton fired and missed and Burr didn't. Some say Hamilton, fired his shot in the air and Burr returned fire and killed Hamilton. But there isn't even a historical consensus as to who supplied the weapons for the duel. Now that we've gotten through a little bit of Hamilton and Aaron Burr, let's move on to some of the other characters and some of the other storylines that there are. We'll start with Angelica Schuyler. Angelica! There are a few things here to unpack. First, unlike what she says in Satisfied, her father did have sons. In fact, Philip Schuyler and his wife Catherine had 15 children, according to Mount Vernon. But only 8 survived to adulthood. And 2 of them were boys. Now, Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy, who are all featured in the show, are the oldest siblings in that order. And Angelica's eldest brother was about 9 years younger than her. Now, obviously, the show makes a big deal about the meeting of Angelica and Hamilton and how she brings Hamilton and Eliza together. None of that happened. In fact, Angelica was already married to John Baker Church when Hamilton's relationship with Eliza began. Angelica had eloped in June 1777, and Eliza and Hamilton's courtship began in early 1780 when he was stationed at Morristown. Angelica wasn't even in the country when Eliza and Hamilton married. Now, these details were likely ignored, to push this romance narrative for these two characters, because it creates an interesting side story, and of course, it is the main crux of the song "Satisfied," which is a terrific song. Fun aside, Annika Nani Rose, who's of course the voice of Tiana in Princess and the Frog, among other things, was the original Angelica Schuyler in the Hamilton mixtape, which was the first full presentation of Hamilton. Well, we talked about Angelica. Now let's talk about Eliza. Eliza in the show largely acts as a foil to Hamilton's political ambitions. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence to support that was the case. And I think that it was probably just something that was used to drive the narrative of Hamilton's insatiable drive. She did leave Hamilton to live with her parents after the Reynolds pamphlet was published. She was 8 months pregnant at the time, and they did get back together later, though not exactly like the show depicts. The play says that they reconciled after the death of Philip in his duel with George Eaker. She was actually 3 months pregnant when Philip died. Now, most of what Eliza's character says in the finale is basically accurate. And Ron Chernow, who wrote the book on Hamilton that inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda to write the play, really credited Eliza with laying the foundation for his research, with the way that she organized everything that he had written and worked to maintain his legacy. All right, now it's time to get into one of the obvious favorites among the characters, and that is...
Everyone give it up for America's favorite fighting Frenchman!
So a couple of things with Marquis de Lafayette, which isn't actually his name. His name is actually like 13 names long or something like that. I'm not going to go into that. But while Hamilton and Lafayette are friends before the war in the show, as we've mentioned before, Lafayette wasn't even in the country. He met Hamilton after the war began as part of Washington's camp in Pennsylvania in 1777. Now, at that point, he had resigned from his post with the French army, bought a ship, and sailed to America to volunteer in the Continental Army at 19 years old. Something else that's more to note later on, when Lafayette is actually no longer part of the play, and Thomas Jefferson has made his introduction. Thomas Jefferson says that he helped Lafayette draft a declaration. Well, that's true. Lafayette received help from Jefferson in drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which the French National Assembly agreed to adopt. But when the French Revolution got violent and Louis XVI was beheaded, as Hamilton notes in Cabinet Battle 2, Lafayette was in some serious trouble. While he did push for more liberty, he was still an aristocrat and wasn't really willing to give that up. and he was the head of the French National Guard, which had a role in protecting the king. So he ultimately had to flee and was imprisoned in Austria while he was trying to escape to America. And eventually, I believe it was Napoleon Bonaparte, got him released. Now, another one of Hamilton's friends
when I do or die, wait till I sally in on a stallion with the first black battalion, never another shot.
Is John Laurens. Now, like Lafayette, Laurens didn't meet Hamilton until later, when they both became aides to Washington in 1777. Miranda's characterization of Laurens as an abolitionist are fairly accurate, and he did head to South Carolina to raise a regiment of slaves who would be granted emancipation in exchange for military service. While Congress eventually supported the plan, they also said that South Carolina and Georgia would have to agree, and both rejected it, and the regiment never formed. Now, in the show, Hamilton also says that Laurens was in South Carolina during the Battle of Yorktown, but Laurens was there at Yorktown, having returned from France, where he had been a special minister with Ben Franklin. He participated in the assault in Yorktown with Hamilton. He helped negotiate the terms of surrender and was present when the British marched out of Yorktown. Now, the show also suggests that Laurens died after the war was already over. Laurens actually died in an ambush at the Battle of Combahee River in August 1782. While the siege of Yorktown was over, and that is largely viewed as the end of the war, the British had not yet evacuated Charlestown, peace had not been formally concluded, and the Treaty of Paris wasn't signed until 1783. And there's one more of Hamilton's trio of friends that we have not talked about yet.
That's right, Hercules Mulligan!
Now, unlike characters like Lafayette and Laurens, Hercules Mulligan did know Hamilton before the war, and they actually lived together. Now, he also did help in the volunteer militia called the Hearts of Oak, which stole British cannons, as is mentioned in Hamilton. He later stayed in New York and provided intelligence as a spy, just as the play states. And at least once, he played a significant role in preventing George Washington's capture, according to the American Battlefield Trust. Now, Mulligan's slave, Cato, most of the time was the one who was actually relaying the intelligence. And so he deserves his recognition as well, because he was very much put in the most dangerous of situations. Now, with that said, Hercules Mulligan didn't have anything to do with spying on the British in advance of the Battle of Yorktown. That was actually a slave by the name of James Armistead Lafayette, who infiltrated the British ranks to inform Lafayette and Washington on the movement of British reinforcements. Now, after the war, he was still a slave. Because he acted as a spy and not a soldier, he wasn't eligible for emancipation through the Act of 1783. So he had to petition Congress for his freedom. And Lafayette supported him in that effort. And so because of that, when he was freed, he took Lafayette's name. So that's a pretty cool side story there. Now, the one last person that I'm going to talk about here and the storyline that I'm going to talk about is Philip Hamilton.
The scholars say I got the same virtuosity. Your brains is my pops. The ladies say my brain's not where the resemblance stops.
Now, Philip Hamilton's role in the play basically surrounds his duel with George Eaker. Now, the show says that Eaker made comments about Alexander Hamilton a week before Philip confronted him and challenged him. But it was actually 4 months later. Now, Hamilton did advise his son to throw away his shot, but the guns weren't Hamilton's like the show says. They were Hamilton's brother-in-law, John Church's guns. Eaker actually had 2 duels on back-to-back days. He actually faced Philip's friend, Richard Price, in a duel the day before, and neither one of them was shot. After surviving that duel, he went on to face Philip Hamilton, and while the play makes it out as if Eaker unfairly fired first, historians say neither initially raised their pistols at all. Both refused to raise. And Eaker eventually did, and Philip followed suit, and Eaker shot him. So the way it's portrayed in the play, again, I think was to create more sympathy, because it makes it seem as if Eaker fired unfairly or prematurely and did not follow the 10 duel commandments, which, by the way, there were actually 25 rules. So that is my somewhat quick breakdown of some of the differences between the history and the show. And like I said before, it's really designed to just give you an understanding of where the story contrasts from reality and where they actually meet in the middle, and kind of the context as to why that may have happened. I hope you found this somewhat educational. If you have other things that you would like to add, feel free to shoot me a message on social media or send me an email and let me know. I'll also give the disclaimer that this is all based on things that I've read from various historians and other materials. And if somehow I got something wrong, please let me know so that I can correct the record. With all that said, I once again hope that you got something out of this, learned a little something, found this exercise fun, especially on this 4th of July. I think it's important that we remember that the facts do matter. So let's all, this weekend, raise a glass to freedom.
Let's have another round tonight.
Let's have another round tonight.
Let's have another round tonight.
Raise a glass to freedom, something they can never take away, no matter what they tell you. Raise a glass to the 4 of us. Tomorrow there'll be more of us, telling the story of tonight.
They'll tell the story of tonight.
Raise a glass to freedom, something they can never take away,
no matter what they tell you.
Let's have another round tonight. Raise a glass to the 4 of us. Tomorrow there'll be more of us, telling the story of tonight. Let's have another round tonight.
They'll tell the story of tonight.
Raise a glass to freedom.
They'll tell the story of tonight.
Raise a glass to freedom.
They'll tell the story of tonight.
They'll tell the story of tonight.
Well, thank you everybody for listening to this episode of the Maza's Musings podcast. I had a lot of fun and found it really interesting putting all this together. And I hope that you had some fun and found an interesting tidbit or two that you can take away. And one thing that I hope is that this doesn't take away from your enjoyment of the show, but just rather gives you a deeper appreciation of the actual history. If you would like to get in contact with us, you can find us on social media. We are at the Maza's Musings Podcast on Facebook. We are at Maza's Musings Pod on Instagram, Threads, and Twitter. We are on TikTok at Maza's Musings Podcast. You can also find us on Blue Sky, and we are on YouTube. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you do listen on YouTube. I also would love it if you guys left a rating or a review on whatever podcast service you use, because that will help boost us in those algorithms and make it easier for people to find this podcast. And if you would like to support just a little bit more, you could buy us a blue milk. And buying us a blue milk helps us with some of those small monetary costs that go into putting this podcast together. However you decide to support us, whether it's listening all the way through to buying us blue milk, we really appreciate it. And you can find out more information about how to support us or what's happening with the podcast by going to our website, mazasmusings.wordpress.com. And while you're there, you can find past episodes, more information about the podcast, and you can subscribe to our newsletter. And once you subscribe to the newsletter, once a week, you will get information on what's coming up, what you might have missed, any information that we find interesting. A lot of times it's contests and sweepstakes or other news that we find interesting. So we figure you'll find it interesting. And from time to time, we'll also shout out other podcasts. Well, now we're going to put a bow on this episode. I hope you all have had a great 4th of July weekend. And I hope you have a great week. Theme music for the Maza's Musings podcast is brought to you by Hi Dad Soup. Check them out at Mickey and Minutes on Instagram.